Man finds giant python attacking pregnant lioness. You won't believe. The lion's response. The first light of dawn painted the Zuberi Reserve in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of grassland that stretched beyond the horizon. Raymond Ray Mallory emerged from his modest wooden hut, the same ritual he had performed every morning for the past 15 years since his retirement from lecturing wildlife biology at the University of Nairobi. His weathered hands gripped his curved walking stick, carved from indigenous mukwa wood, while his other hand clutched a leather-bound notebook filled with decades of observations, sketches, and the intimate stories of the creatures that called this wilderness home. At 73, Ray's body bore the marks of a lifetime spent under the African sun. His skin was deeply tanned and lined like ancient parchment, his white hair thinned by years of wind and weather, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, trained by countless hours of patient observation to catch the smallest details that others might miss. This morning felt different, though he couldn't yet articulate why. The air carried an unusual stillness, a tension that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface of the visible world. As he began his morning walk, following the well-worn path that led to his favorite observation point on a slight ridge overlooking a natural waterhole, Ray noticed something that made him pause mid-step. The silence was too complete, too profound. In all his years in the bush, he had learned that silence often preceded the most dramatic moments in nature's theater. No birds called from the scattered acacia trees. No insects buzzed in the warming air. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. Ray's trained ear picked up on this absence of sound immediately. Normally, the dawn chorus would be beginning by now. The liquid notes of the red-eyed dove, the harsh call of the go-away bird, the chattering of weaver birds beginning their daily activities. The fact that this natural symphony was entirely absent sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Reaching into the breast pocket of his khaki field shirt, Ray withdrew a pair of well-used binoculars, their black metal surfaces worn smooth by decades of handling. The leather strap had been repaired multiple times with careful stitching, a testament to the countless hours they had spent around his neck, becoming as much a part of him as his walking stick or his notebook. He raised them to his eyes and began a systematic scan of the grassland before him. The magnified view revealed details invisible to the naked eye, the way certain patches of grass were flattened and disturbed, creating subtle tracks that told stories of the night's activities. Ray had learned to read these signs like text, understanding the language of bent stems and displaced earth that revealed which creatures had passed this way, when they had traveled, and often, what urgent business had driven them through the darkness. One particular disturbance caught his attention immediately. The grass had been pushed aside in a way that suggested something massive had moved through recently, something that traveled not on legs, but by sliding its entire body across the ground. The pattern was unmistakable to Ray's experienced eyes, the sinuous trail left by a large snake, and from the width of the disturbance, an exceptionally large snake. Ray's pulse quickened as he followed the trail with his binoculars, tracing its path across the landscape. African rock pythons were not uncommon in the reserve, but one large enough to leave such an obvious trail was rare and potentially dangerous. These magnificent predators could grow to extraordinary lengths, sometimes exceeding 20 feet, and their hunting strategy was as patient as it was deadly. They would lie in wait for days if necessary, perfectly camouflaged, until the perfect opportunity presented itself. Adjusting the focus on his binoculars for a more detailed view, Ray swept his gaze across the area where the snake's trail disappeared into a cluster of tall grass near the waterhole. What he saw next made his breath catch in his throat and his hands tighten involuntarily on the binoculars. There, partially concealed by the golden stems of elephant grass, was a scene that would haunt his dreams for years to come. A massive African rock python, its body as thick as a man's torso and gleaming with an oily sheen in the morning light, was coiled in deadly embrace around a lioness. But this was not just any lioness. Ray recognized her immediately as Nala, the sole female member of a pride he had been studying and protecting for over a decade. Nala's pregnancy was unmistakable. Her belly was swollen with cubs that would represent not just her own offspring, but the future of the entire pride. Without her and her cubs, the three males, Zuberi, Zane, and Keto, would eventually disperse or die without reproducing, effectively ending a bloodline that Ray had documented and cherished for years. The importance of this single lioness transcended her individual life. She carried within her the continuation of generations. The python's attack had been perfectly executed with the patience and precision that had made these serpents apex predators for millions of years. Its powerful coils wrapped around Nala's midsection, each muscular loop designed to tighten with every breath she exhaled, gradually suffocating her while protecting the snake from her formidable claws and teeth. Ray could see the lioness struggling, her powerful legs kicking weakly, her claws raking the ground in desperate furrows. But the python's grip was inexorable. What struck Ray as almost unbearable to witness was the sound, or rather, the progressive absence of sound. Nala's roars, which should have shaken the grassland and announced her defiance to every creature within miles, were being steadily choked off. Each attempted roar became weaker, more strained, until they dissolved into barely audible gasps. The sight of such a magnificent predator being slowly, methodically killed stirred something primal in Ray's chest. Through his binoculars, Ray could also see the three male lions, Zuberi, Zane, and Keto, positioned in a rough circle around the deadly struggle. Their behavior was what puzzled and frustrated him most. These were not cowardly animals. Each of them weighed over 400 pounds of muscle, bone, and killing instinct. Their claws could rip through buffalo hide. Their jaws could crush the spine of a zebra. And together, they had brought down animals many times their size. Yet here they stood, frozen in apparent indecision. They paced in tight circles, their tails lashing with agitation, their deep growls rumbling like distant thunder. But they made no move to attack. Ray understood that this hesitation was not cowardice, but confusion. Lions were programmed by millions of years of evolution to hunt in coordinated groups, to respond to specific triggers and threats. A giant snake wrapped around their mate presented a problem their instincts struggled to solve. The male lions had never encountered anything quite like this situation. They knew the lioness was in mortal danger. Their agitated behavior made that clear. But the python's strategy of using Nala's own body as a shield complicated any rescue attempt. Any attack on the snake risked injuring or killing the very animal they sought to save. Their territorial instincts and protective impulses warred with their uncertainty about how to proceed. Zuberi, the largest and most dominant of the three males, was particularly distressed. His massive head swayed back and forth as he searched for an opening, an opportunity to strike without endangering Nala. His mane, darker and fuller than those of his companions, bristled with tension. Occasionally, he would take a few steps forward, then stop, growl in frustration, and pace away again. The other two lions mirrored his behavior, creating a scene of barely controlled feline anxiety. Ray lowered his binoculars and felt the full weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. In all his decades of studying wildlife, he had learned to maintain professional detachment, to observe and document without interfering in the natural processes of predation and survival. Nature was neither cruel nor kind, it simply was. Every creature played its role in the complex web of life and death that maintained the ecosystem's balance. But this situation transcended simple predation. The death of Nala would not just claim one animal's life, it would effectively doom the entire pride and end years of Ray's research and protection efforts. More than that, it would eliminate a genetic line that had adapted specifically to this environment over countless generations. The cubs growing in Nala's womb represented irreplaceable biological diversity, the product of evolutionary refinement that could never be recreated. Standing there in the morning light, Ray faced a moment of reckoning. His scientific training told him to remain an observer, to let nature take its course regardless of his personal feelings. But his deeper humanity, his years of connection to these particular animals, and his understanding of what their loss would mean drove him toward intervention. The decision crystallized suddenly, sparked by a shift in the wind that brought with it the sharp, metallic scent of blood. Ray's experienced nose detected not just Nala's blood, where the python's constriction had begun to cause internal injuries, but also the snake's blood, indicating that the lioness had managed to inflict some wounds with her claws before being fully subdued. This smell would travel on the morning air, advertising the struggle to every scavenger and predator within miles. In the distance, Ray could hear the thundering of hooves as a herd of antelope, spooked by some disturbance, stampeded across the plains. The sound echoed like war drums, adding to the tension that seemed to electrify the air around the life and death struggle playing out in the grass. Time was running out, not just for Nala, but for any hope of intervention. Ray's mind raced through possibilities. He was a 73-year-old man, armed with nothing more than a walking stick and the contents of his field kit, against a python that might weigh several hundred pounds and 3 confused but potentially dangerous lions. He was laughably outmatched in terms of physical capability. But his decades of experience had taught him that in nature, intelligence and understanding often trumped raw power. The key, Ray realized, lay not in attacking the python directly, but in breaking the psychological deadlock that held the male lions paralyzed. They possessed all the physical tools necessary to save Nala, but they needed direction, needed some external trigger to overcome their instinctive confusion and transform their agitation into coordinated action. Ray began walking slowly toward the scene, each step measured and deliberate. His walking stick tapped rhythmically against the ground, not loud enough to startle the animals, but sufficient to announce his approach. As he drew closer, details became visible that had been obscured by distance. The python was even larger than he had initially estimated, its diamond-patterned scales gleaming with an almost hypnotic beauty that belied its deadly purpose. Nala's struggles were becoming weaker, her breathing more labored. The python's coils covered her from shoulders to hindquarters, leaving only her head and legs free. Her golden eyes, usually bright with the fierce intelligence of an apex predator, were beginning to show the glassy quality that preceded unconsciousness. Ray could see that she had perhaps minutes before the constriction would prove fatal. When Ray was approximately 20 yards from the struggle, Zuberi noticed his approach. The massive lion turned toward him, his yellow eyes fixed on this unexpected intrusion into the crisis. A low growl rumbled from deep in the lion's chest, not immediately threatening, but clearly a warning. Ray had worked near these animals long enough to read their body language fluently. Zuberi was torn between viewing him as a threat to be driven off and recognizing him as the familiar human who had shared their territory for years without harm. Ray stopped his approach and spoke in a calm, steady voice, the same tone he had used thousands of times when conducting field research near dangerous animals. "I'm not here to harm," he said, knowing that the words themselves meant nothing to the lions, but that his tone and demeanor would communicate his intentions more clearly than language ever could. "I'm here to help." The 3 male lions had encountered Ray countless times over the years. He had observed them from respectful distances, had documented their hunts and territorial disputes, had even provided assistance during droughts by maintaining the water sources in their territory. They knew his scent, his voice, his non-threatening behavior. This familiarity was the foundation upon which Ray now hoped to build trust in this critical moment. Ray reached into his pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, one that carried years of his own scent from countless days in the field. It was a calculated risk, but he understood that scent carried more information for these animals than any visual or auditory signal could convey. With a deliberate motion, he tossed the handkerchief toward the python, not close enough to interfere with the struggle, but near enough to add his familiar scent to the complex chemical signals filling the air. The effect was subtle but immediate. The 3 male lions, who had been pacing in obvious distress, focused their attention more sharply on the scene. Ray's intervention, minimal as it was, seemed to provide the external catalyst they needed to overcome their paralysis. It was as if his presence had given them permission to act, had broken some invisible barrier that their instincts had erected. Ray knew he needed to do more than simply provide psychological encouragement. The python was too large and too well positioned to be dislodged by the lions alone, especially while they remained confused about how to attack without harming Nala. He needed to create a moment of opportunity, a brief window in which the snake's grip might loosen enough for the lions to act effectively. Gripping his walking stick more firmly, Ray approached closer to the struggle. The python's tail extended beyond its coils around Nala, lying partially exposed in the short grass. Ray realized that if he could deliver a sharp blow to this vulnerable extremity, it might cause the snake to reflexively loosen its grip, or at least shift its position enough to give the lions an opening. The action required more courage than Ray had ever demanded of himself. Stepping within striking distance of a giant python, while three agitated lions watched, was perhaps the most dangerous thing he had ever contemplated. But Nala's breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, and he could see that without immediate intervention, she would lose consciousness within minutes. Ray raised his walking stick and brought it down sharply across the python's tail. The impact sent vibrations through the snake's body, and Ray felt the solid thunk as the carved wood struck the muscular flesh. The python's reaction was immediate and violent. Its entire body convulsed, and its massive head, which had been positioned near Nala's shoulder, lifted and turned toward this new threat. This moment, the brief lifting of the python's head and the slight loosening of its coils as it reacted to the unexpected attack, was exactly what Ray had hoped to create. The change in the dynamic of the struggle was like the release of a spring that had been compressed beyond its limit. Zuberi responded instantly, his confusion evaporating in a surge of protective rage. With a roar that shook the grassland and announced his fury to every creature within miles, the massive lion launched himself at the python's exposed head. His leap covered the distance in a single bound. 400 pounds of muscle and bone, driven by the imperative to protect his mate and future offspring. The impact when Zuberi struck the python was tremendous. His claws, each as long as a man's finger and sharp as surgical instruments, raked across the snake's skull and neck, seeking purchase on the slippery scales. His massive jaws, capable of crushing the spine of a buffalo, clamped down on the python's neck just behind its head, the ideal position to prevent the snake from turning to bite while maximizing the damage his teeth could inflict. Zane and Keto joined the attack within seconds, their earlier paralysis completely abandoned in the face of their leader's decisive action. The scene transformed from a slow strangulation into a chaotic melee of teeth, claws, scales, and fur. The three lions worked with the coordination that had made them successful hunters for years, each taking a position that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing the risk of interfering with his partners. Zane attacked the python's midsection, his powerful jaws crushing down on the snake's body where it was thickest. His goal was not necessarily to kill, but to cause enough pain and damage to force the python to release its grip on Nala. Keto focused on the tail section, using his claws to rake deep wounds in the snake's flesh while positioning himself to prevent the python from using its powerful tail as a weapon. The python, despite being attacked by three large predators, was far from helpless. Millions of years of evolution had equipped it with defensive capabilities that made it a formidable opponent even under these circumstances. Its muscles, designed to crush the life from large mammals, were equally effective at resisting attack. Its scales, harder than fingernails and overlapping like armor, provided significant protection against claws and teeth. But the python's greatest disadvantage in this fight was that it could not release Nala without giving up its meal and exposing itself to the full fury of the three male lions. The snake was trapped by its own predatory strategy. Having committed to this attack, it had no choice but to maintain its grip and hope to outlast its attackers. The battle raged with an intensity that Ray had never witnessed in all his years of wildlife observation. The sounds were tremendous, the lion's roars of effort and rage, the wet tearing of flesh and scales, the impact of powerful bodies colliding and rolling in the dust. Blood flew in all directions, some from the python's wounds, some from scratches the lions had sustained in their desperate attack. Ray watched with growing concern as the fight continued without the python showing any signs of releasing its grip on Nala. Despite the savage mauling it was receiving, the snake's constricting muscles remained locked around the lioness. Ray could see that Nala's breathing had become even more labored, her tongue beginning to protrude slightly from her mouth in the unmistakable sign of severe oxygen deprivation. The realization struck Ray that the lion's attack, while fierce and well-coordinated, might not be sufficient to save Nala's life. The python could potentially maintain its grip even while being killed, and by the time the lions succeeded in dispatching their enemy, Nala might already be dead from suffocation. Ray reached into another pocket of his field vest and withdrew a small canister of pepper spray, standard equipment for researchers working in areas with dangerous wildlife. The spray was designed to deter charging animals by temporarily incapacitating their ability to see and breathe. But Ray had never had occasion to use it in all his years of fieldwork. The challenge was timing and positioning. The python's head was partially concealed by Zuberi's massive body as the lion maintained his crushing grip on the snake's neck. Ray needed to wait for exactly the right moment when the snake's head would be exposed and positioned for an effective spray application. The opportunity came when the python, in a desperate attempt to free itself from Zuberi's grip, lifted its head and opened its mouth in a threat display. For just a moment, its eyes and nostrils were clearly visible and accessible. Ray stepped forward and discharged the pepper spray directly into the snake's face from a distance of less than 3 feet. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The capsaicin-based spray, designed to incapacitate mammals, proved equally effective on the python's sensitive mucous membranes. The snake's eyes began streaming immediately, and its respiratory system reacted violently to the chemical irritant. For the first time since the attack had begun, the python's grip loosened significantly as its body convulsed in response to the spray. This momentary weakening of the python's coils was all the lions needed. Zuberi redoubled his attack on the snake's head and neck, his jaws working to crush the vital vertebrae that controlled the python's nervous system. Zane and Keto, sensing that victory was within reach, intensified their assault on the snake's body, their claws opening deep wounds that began to sap the python's strength. The python, blinded and choking from the pepper spray while being savaged by 3 lions, finally reached the limits of its endurance. With a final convulsive shudder that ran the length of its massive body, the snake released its grip on Nala and attempted to escape into the tall grass, where it might find refuge from its attackers. But the lions were not willing to let their enemy escape. Zuberi maintained his grip on the python's neck, while Zane and Keto continued their assault on its body. The snake's movements became increasingly uncoordinated as blood loss and the cumulative damage from the lion's attack began to take their toll. Ray watched as the python, its scales now dull, with dust and blood, made one final attempt to reach the safety of the grass. It managed to pull perhaps 10 feet away from where Nala lay motionless before its strength finally gave out entirely. The massive predator that had seemed so invincible just minutes earlier now lay still, its diamond patterns fading into the earth as its life ebbed away. The 3 male lions stood panting around their fallen enemy, their fur matted with blood and their sides heaving from the exertion of the battle. But their attention quickly turned from the dead python to Nala, who lay unnaturally still in the flattened grass where the struggle had taken place. Ray approached slowly, his own heart pounding from the adrenaline of the confrontation and his concern for Nala's condition. The lioness was unconscious, her breathing barely perceptible, her body showing the clear marks where the python's coils had compressed her ribcage and abdomen. Ray knelt beside her, careful to move slowly and keep his hands visible to the 3 male lions, who watched his every motion with intense scrutiny. Placing his hand gently on Nala's chest, Ray felt for her heartbeat. It was there, weak but steady, and he could detect the subtle rise and fall that indicated she was still breathing. The python's attack had brought her to the very edge of death, but she had survived. The question now was whether she and her unborn cubs had sustained internal injuries that might prove fatal despite her rescue. The 3 male lions approached Nala's unconscious form with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the savage fury they had displayed moments earlier. Zuberi, his massive muzzle still stained with the python's blood, began gently licking Nala's face and neck. Zane and Keto positioned themselves on either side of her body, their own bodies forming a protective barrier against any other threats that might approach. Ray found himself included in this protective circle, accepted by the lions as part of their defensive formation rather than viewed as a threat to be driven away. It was a moment of interspecies cooperation that transcended the normal boundaries between human and predator, forged in the shared experience of preserving life against the forces that would destroy it. Using his satellite phone, a piece of technology that seemed almost alien in this ancient landscape, Ray called for emergency veterinary support from the reserve headquarters. Dr. Sarah Kimani, the reserve's head veterinarian, responded immediately to his description of the situation. She would arrive by helicopter within the hour, bringing the medical equipment and expertise needed to properly assess and treat Nala's injuries. While waiting for professional help to arrive, Ray opened his field medical kit and withdrew a mild sedative designed for use on large mammals. Nala was beginning to show signs of regaining consciousness, and Ray knew that her first instinct upon awakening would likely be to flee or fight, either of which could exacerbate her injuries. A gentle sedative would keep her calm and motionless until Dr. Passon, Kimani could complete a thorough examination. The three male lions watched with remarkable patience as Ray administered the sedative through a small syringe inserted into the muscle of Nala's hindquarter. Their acceptance of his intervention spoke to years of careful relationship building and their recognition that he posed no threat to their injured mate in any other circumstances. Approaching an unconscious lioness surrounded by three protective males would have been tantamount to suicide. Dr. Kimani arrived exactly 57 minutes after Ray's call, her helicopter touching down in a clearing, approximately 200 yards from where Nala lay. She approached on foot, carrying her veterinary equipment in a reinforced case designed for field conditions. Her years of experience with African wildlife had prepared her for many challenging situations, but treating an injured lioness in the presence of three adult males was among the most difficult scenarios she had ever faced. The examination revealed that Nala had sustained significant but not life-threatening injuries. Several ribs showed hairline fractures from the python's constriction, and there was evidence of internal bleeding that would require monitoring. Most critically, the blood supply to her uterus appeared to have been compromised during the attack, raising serious concerns about the viability of her cubs. Dr. Kimani made the decision to transport Nala to the reserve's medical facility, where she could receive round-the-clock monitoring and intensive care. The three male lions followed the transport vehicle for over a mile before finally stopping at the boundary of their territory, their low calls carrying across the grassland long after the vehicle had disappeared from sight. The following weeks tested everyone involved in Nala's care. The lioness recovered slowly from her physical injuries, the fractures in her ribs healing and the internal bleeding stopping, without the need for surgical intervention, but the status of her cubs remained uncertain. Ultrasound examinations showed that both cubs were alive, but possibly stressed by the trauma their mother had endured. Ray visited the medical facility daily, ostensibly to check on Nala's progress, but actually driven by a deeper need to see this story through to its conclusion. His intervention in the attack had created a bond of responsibility that he could not simply abandon. He had altered the natural course of events, and he felt obligated to ensure that his interference had ultimately served the cause of life rather than merely prolonging suffering. The night Nala gave birth was illuminated by a crescent moon that cast silver shadows across the reserve. Ray was present at Dr. Kimani's invitation, watching from outside the enclosure as Nala delivered two healthy cubs. The first was a male, robust and vocal from his first breath, already showing the strong limbs and broad head that suggested he would grow into a formidable lion. The second was a female, smaller than her brother, but equally vigorous, her movements indicating the perfect coordination of a healthy newborn. The three male lions, who had maintained a vigil outside the medical facility for the entire duration of Nala's recovery, seemed to sense the moment of birth, despite being separated from her by walls and distance. Their roars that night carried across the entire reserve, announcing to every creature within miles that new life had entered the world and that the pride's future was secure. Ray sat in his field chair outside the facility, his notebook open on his lap, attempting to capture in words the emotions and observations of the night. But language seemed inadequate to convey the complexity of what he had witnessed and participated in. The intersection of human intelligence and wild instinct, the cooperation between species in the face of mortal threat, the triumph of life over death. These themes seemed too large for his simple prose. As dawn approached, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the African wilderness awakening to a new day, Ray closed his notebook and reflected on the events that had brought him to this moment. His decision to intervene in the python's attack had violated every principle of non-interference he had learned in his scientific training. Yet it had ultimately preserved not just individual lives, but an entire genetic lineage. The release of Nala and her cubs back into semi-wild conditions 3 months later marked the culmination of one of the most successful wildlife rescue operations in the reserve's history. A large enclosure had been constructed that allowed the family group to live in conditions that closely approximated their natural environment while still providing security and medical monitoring. The three male lions were released into the same enclosure, and their reunion with Nala and the cubs was everything Ray had hoped it would be. Zuberi immediately took on the role of primary protector, positioning himself between the cubs and any perceived threats. Zane and Quito shared duties as scouts and secondary guardians, their earlier confusion about how to respond to danger replaced by a clear understanding of their responsibilities. The cubs thrived in this protected environment, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. Ray observed them from an elevated height that allowed him to document their development without interfering with their natural behaviors. The male cub, whom Ray privately named Django, showed early signs of the dominance and leadership qualities that would eventually make him a pride leader in his own right. The female, whom he called Zuberi, displayed the hunting instincts and maternal potential that would ensure the continuation of the bloodline into future generations. 6 months after the python attack, Ray encountered the pride during one of his regular morning walks through the reserve. They had been released from the enclosure and had successfully re-established their territory in their original range. The reunion was both expected and miraculous. Expected because Ray had maintained his routine and the lions had maintained theirs. Miraculous because of the shared experience that had forever changed their relationship. Django, now a robust juvenile with the confidence of a young lion who had never known serious hunger or threat, approached Ray without fear. The young lion rubbed against Ray's leg in the universal feline gesture of friendship and acceptance, then settled on the ground beside him, as if this interspecies companionship was the most natural thing in the world. The three adult males watched this interaction with what Ray interpreted as approval rather than concern. Their body language suggested that they viewed Ray not as an intruder in their territory but as an accepted member of their extended social group, someone who had proven his loyalty and value during their darkest hour. Ray gently placed his hand on Django's head, feeling the coarse texture of the young lion's mane just beginning to develop around his ears and neck. In that moment of contact between human and lion, between the civilized and the wild, Ray felt a connection that transcended species and touched something fundamental about the nature of life itself. The moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Ray quietly stood and began walking away. Understanding instinctively that prolonging the interaction would be inappropriate, Django watched him go but made no effort to follow, having received whatever confirmation or reassurance he had been seeking through their brief contact. A motion-activated camera, part of the reserve's wildlife monitoring system, captured the entire encounter. The footage, showing an elderly man sitting peacefully beside a young lion while three adult males looked on without aggression, became one of the most widely viewed wildlife videos in internet history. The accompanying story of Ray's intervention in the python attack spread across social media platforms, generating millions of views and comments from people around the world. But Ray himself remained largely unaware of his internet fame. He continued his daily routine of observation and documentation. His focus remained on the scientific work that had defined his entire adult life. The viral video and global attention seemed less important to him than the simple fact that Nala, Django, Zuberi, and the three males were alive and thriving in their natural environment. One evening, as Ray sat on the porch of his wooden hut, reviewing the day's observations, he heard the distinctive low growl that served as Nala's greeting call. Looking up from his notebook, he saw her standing approximately 20 meters away, her golden coat burnished by the setting sun, her posture relaxed but alert. Ray smiled and spoke into the gathering darkness. "It's been a while, Mama." Nala's response was a brief chuff, the sound lionesses make to communicate with their cubs or to acknowledge familiar individuals without aggression. She held Ray's gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes, he saw not the gratitude that humans might feel, but something deeper. A recognition of the bond that had been forged in blood and terror and had somehow transcended the normal boundaries between their species. As night settled over the Zuberi Reserve, Ray reflected on the lessons he had learned from that morning, months earlier when silence had preceded the most dramatic rescue of his career. Nature's apparent cruelty often masked deeper purposes, and sometimes the preservation of life required the courage to act despite uncertainty about the consequences. His intervention had saved not just individual animals, but an entire family line, ensuring that future generations would inherit the genetic legacy of lions who had learned to trust, to cooperate, and to survive against impossible odds. The story continued to unfold with each passing season, as Django grew into adolescence and began showing interest in establishing his own territory. As Zuri matured into a skilled huntress who would soon be ready to bear cubs of her own. As the three adult males maintained their protective vigilance over the family group that represented their genetic immortality. Ray's notebooks filled with observations and sketches documenting every aspect of their development, creating a scientific record that would contribute to the understanding of lion behavior and conservation for decades to come. But beyond the academic value of his work, Ray had discovered something more personal and profound, that the boundaries between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, were more fluid than he had ever imagined. In the end, the python attack had revealed fundamental truths about courage, cooperation, and the lengths to which any parent will go to protect their offspring, whether human or lion. The imperative to preserve life and ensure the continuation of the species transcended individual differences and created bonds that neither time nor distance could break. Ray's wooden walking stick, now scarred from its impact with the python's scales, stood as a testament to the moment when compassion overcame caution, and when an elderly scientist discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with theories and hypotheses, but with simple human decency and the courage to act when action is required. The grasslands of the Zuberi Reserve continued their ancient rhythm of seasons, rains, and migrations. But they now held within their golden expanse a story of interspecies cooperation that challenged conventional understanding of the relationship between humans and the natural world. And somewhere in the vast African wilderness, a pride of lions continued to thrive because one man with a walking stick had decided that some boundaries were meant to be crossed in the service of life itself.